Hey everyone, I'm Noctis Corvus, but you can call me Noctis. Before I even begin to touch on today's video and this week's stuff, I just want to thank everyone for the support and interest in my previous video. I mean, it was far more than I ever began to expect or anticipate. Besides, the comments people left were really nice, and I'm simply so glad that people enjoyed watching it, just as much as I enjoyed making it. I originally wasn't sure if I would sell the prints of these pieces, but since people seem to like them, they are available over on my Etsy for the next few months. I will also be shifting my schedule a little bit more this month, more than I originally intended at least, and I will be adding another Pride upload this month, as I had already been toying with the idea as I had other flags I wanted to look at anyway, and there was a few requests for certain flags that I can include. So anyway, with all of that said, let's actually focus on this week then, shall we? Today I'm back to a regular drawing, though it isn't just an image on its own or a character I enjoy drawing. Instead, this landscape is part of developments from something I'm currently putting into the works in the background, though I will be talking about it today as it is core to the idea phase of this piece. It's something I've been developing the past few weeks now, I want to say, and I had ideas brewing a lot longer for it, as it then combines multiple parts of my interests. So let's just get into it. See, I began this channel as I enjoy art and writing, one of those being more present here than the other, yet that isn't something I exactly mind most of the time. One of them takes a little bit more time than the other, so it was only natural that I focused in on the art side on this more often than not, as it was also what I had been enjoying at the time and enjoying doing it here. But alongside it, I kept a story running for myself, and just to keep both parts present here of my interests. And it was only a simple story, but a longer one I had fun developing and building the characters for. It is also something I've tried to write many times, but first and foremost, it was fun. And yes, it was entirely for myself. I made it because I enjoyed it, and kept it going as it gave me something different to work on alongside all of this. And I enjoyed it. I love the characters and still do. The story is still something that I want to tell. Yet, I didn't so much enjoy the format for it anymore, or how the story had been heading or developing. It grew stale, and I had other ideas that I wanted to include here and there, or maybe make something a little bit different, yet felt that I had to tell that story first. One thing at a time, if that makes sense, or otherwise avoid confusing various worlds the stories are set in. So I will admit that I got a little tired of it. I still like it, still taught it for myself and that break or diversity here, yet it just wasn't as fun as it previously had been. For a while I will admit that I have been considering changing it or stopping it. Maybe restart it in another format, or look at what else I could do with it. I just didn't know exactly what I would want to do with it though, so I kept it going for myself and considered it behind the scenes. After all, under no circumstances did I want to stop it, and not have another story format to replace it with, or something else to diversify from these sorts of speed paints. That is also nothing against these videos. Just to clarify, I love these and they're so much fun for me to work on as I do enjoy the process. I just want to experiment and play with stuff like this sometimes, as doing the same thing time and time again, week in and week out, would eventually get tiring for myself and I would lose interest. And this is fun at the moment, so I wouldn't want to ruin that just by playing it safe and keeping to what I know, when there are ideas for things to try here or there. All of this is to say that I let myself think and I let myself consider every option to be sure I didn't just rush into something, or decide on a course of action based on a single moment and impulse. And in the end, I have something I'm quite excited about and I am enjoying the behind the scenes of at the moment. After all, before I share anything, I at least need part of the world set up and some idea of what I'm doing. But everything I'm working on at the moment for it is actually quite enjoyable. especially with the way it lets me go into the depths that I usually just don't need for stories. And doing it in this manner lets me expand on anything I want, just so I can form something more interesting than previously. So yes, this image is a single location of a larger thing. It's an idea I had been messing around with, as I wasn't even sure if something like this would fit into the world that I'm currently building. Yet the further I worked on it, the more sense it made and the more I wanted to continue with this idea. It's actually part of what made me excited to continue with every other aspect, so I didn't turn away from it. It was really a combination of this and the map that I later developed for it. After all, I had the idea in my mind and I was still on the fence for it, so I decided to start parts of it and see if the enthusiasm held up or if I liked it in theory more than practice. It meant I had an excuse to develop a map either way, which was rather enjoyable and something I rarely need to do or get to do, though I enjoy working on them quite a bit. Making maps up is something I've always favoured as a one-off thing I can do whenever a project lets me. But that map then led into pages worth of notes and hours put into making sense of just the basics and the sections I had ideas for so far. So, unsurprisingly, it cemented that I would be doing it and taking that step. Seeing the map layout just gave me too many ideas and prompted new avenues I needed to develop and wanted to work on. That meant I made the choice. I would stop the other series, for now, and pay attention to a new format for things that will be interesting to see come together in a new sense. This new manner also has more potential for things around here, so I wanted to try it. It did mean unlisting the other series, but long term, it will kind of work out better in my mind at least. Besides, with the way it is working at the moment, I can reintroduce parts of that story later, but in a sense that I think better fits the characters and the world. Which is, finally, where this picture comes into play. I mean, I mentioned having the idea for it and maybe a rough sketch, but nothing quite like this until I knew I would be taking the map further. I sort of had been working on the principle that if I didn't like the map, I could always do this idea as a standalone thing and pretend it was never part of something wider to myself. Naturally, here we are, and the wider thing is still working itself out in the background as I speak. But the drawing itself, that is the main part of this video, and it has changed drastically from that very first idea I had of it, so it's about time we turn our attention towards it. See, the original idea had been almost a desert sort of environment, with the ravine aspect being something unusual within the world itself. Yet the further I drew and developed things, I instead wanted these unique sort of mountains around it, as if this area is instead somewhere that happens to naturally have these sort of unique formations. The desert idea then came to be abandoned as well, especially since I wanted to relocate it in the world itself, to a place without deserts and these sorts of settled areas. It then didn't make sense for the people, I imagine, that would have ended up living here to be in a desert situation or the style I wanted to take on it. From that, the overgrown aesthetic came to just sort of fit it better between the mountains and the forests too, especially with everything else considered. So it meant that I could look at other inspirations and ended up drawing somewhat from the Pillar Mountains in China. Now, I would love to try and pronounce the name of the national forest they're part of, but I have no clue how to even attempt such a thing and feel that I'd butcher it in many, many ways. But they're the mountains that sort of look like they're pillars and are these really unique formations, and the image has always sort of stuck out with me, just to somewhat reference it later. And, well, this was my chance. After all, I knew I would have some sort of mountain somewhere, especially once I moved it. It only made sense I would with the ravine and the other options I would include in the piece. Whether the mountain was nearer the middle ground or something on the horizon was a choice that I made as well as I went, and as I looked at how they all would appear. And as part of this, the pillar format stood out and slotted nicely into the place, whilst also making it somewhat interesting for the landscape to look at. Besides, it then paired well with this idea I had around the ravine and this sort of settlement. See, I sort of imagined that they began underground. Reasons still being worked out there the more I develop stuff, but then that this particular settlement came to expand into the ravine and built this system along the walls and left part of it exposed as they were expanding. After all, most of this image was drawn knowing most of the town would be unseen and underground, regardless of the details I chose to make present. But by adding in the Pillar Mountains, I could then see it expanding to these areas as well, and gradually coming to span between various pillars or potentially developing internally to these, just as they would need. So the settlement would eventually occupy most of the underground area, the pillars and the ravine, and sort of spread beyond the eye. So this sketch was sort of kept as it made sense, and it interested me as it then let me imagine more of the world and how something like this would grow. It helped me establish this part of the world and part of its story as to how it became what it becomes. I mean, over time it would then make sense to have some structures on the ground, just as normal, after expanding into the ravine and leaving signs of life there. I sort of thought the houses would belong to those who moved here and preferred it, or those who need above ground to do things relating to aspects of their work too. But that wasn't all entirely clear in this piece, and more something I kept for the world building side of it. Most of it from that point had then been trial and error, developments to see what worked and what didn't, just until I had a sketch that I liked, and that I could then develop. And yes, I will touch on the other details in a moment, and maybe go over those I've brushed past here. Yet I want to talk a little bit on the colours chosen, just for a short while before I skip ahead past it. And this one is only a short point. I mean, there isn't much to say since I chose pretty natural colours and I did want to keep it fairly bright. Yet I do feel that in saying that I should address the blue trees, just because I did just say that I wanted it natural. So I want to clarify the choice. See, the world will be a fantasy theme, so I can get away with more than I would if I were basing it strictly off the laws and reality of our world. The fantasy choice and other things associated with the world building are mainly done so I have the freedom to develop it as I want, but also to let myself be creative with how things work and the way things that would appear. It's why I let myself look at these trees having blue trunks, as, for one, it simply fits this palette better. But for a second reason, it made sense that I could make it a reason that the trees are like this that then connects into the world and other parts of that again. And it would tie into why these people are here and why this area is what it is. So yes, I picked a natural palette, yet it was mainly also done to experiment with how unusual things may look for me in the world, and what sort of changes I would want to add as I go. Aside from this, everything else ended up fairly and somewhat ordinary, though I didn't mind it as the colours were fun to work with for a change. Yes, it is mainly an ocean of greens, but that was oddly part of my goals and my joy in this drawing. And that let me experiment with what I would otherwise draw with. I mean, I would normally make the colours somewhat unusual, just to mess and have fun with it. But I did say in the previous video that I want to try and use brighter colours a bit more, and this was sort of the perfect chance to do that. It wouldn't have made much sense to make it all a darker palette, or to make it into something else. I instead wanted this to be bright and cheerful in a sense, but also feel like it was overgrown. And ultimately the overgrown element was important too. I wanted something that looks like this place has massive bushes and forests, something flourishing and tucked away, yet also being established somewhat with paths and other things that make it feel alive. I didn't mind using the green so often with it like this, and I actually found myself tempted to draw another variation of this location, but with the seasons changing. Just where it may include far more tones and colours, and that one would be purely for my own enjoyment. But whether I do that or not is still sort of up for debate. And if I did, I would draw a different section of this or a different part of this area. Though it does mean that the colours were fun to use, and it was something a bit different. It also helped me secure further ideas around the world and maybe how things would work here and there. Just parts of the small things that I hadn't yet considered, as I'm still looking at the broader parts. So, with that being said, let's spend the rest of this time talking about the little details, shall we? I have a few to go over and enough time to spend to get through all of them. I have touched on a few points, the mountains and blueness of the trees, so I won't really go over them again. I really have nothing else to say about them. But this drawing is made up of a few more smaller details that I just want to address as I go here. The first of these is that I want to address the little houses a bit more. I know I may have brushed over them before, mentioned they'd be part of the town and such, but I just want to go into further detail as to why I chose to tie them into this, and what my logic has really been behind all of it. And I won't spend long on this detail in particular. There isn't quite so much that I could say, but there are one or two things that I just want to maybe touch on here for a short while, just before we get into everything else. Like the fact that these details were parts that I added on as I went with the sketch. Parts that I just added with colour before even drawing them in, just as I wanted to see how they would look within this context of it all. It was done off the idea that, yes, they would eventually have more buildings above ground where they could, but not many at the moment that I was drawing from. And again, it was sort of with the idea that, especially if the environment had these pillar mountains, it would kind of change how they would build different sections of the town. And even then, it was the idea that most people would still live underground, not so much in the buildings they do place above ground. So I knew that these houses didn't need to be fancy, especially at the distances I put them at. I didn't want to detail everything about them like windows and doors, and sort of wanted to keep them quite generic for now. Only since this is all early stage work, it's all loose ideas still. I don't quite know what the buildings of this area may look like, or how this town would differ from others nearby. So it made sense to instead prefer a few placeholders to work with for now, rather than getting caught up on all of the details at this stage. And I don't think it took away from too much. Everything is only an early idea, and the shell format doesn't steal attention away from the ravine at the centre of the piece. It was something I was aware of, not wanting them to be too intruding visually, and I didn't want them to take away from the idea. And I do think that in this manner it worked. The most I did is add shading details to them in that stage, and looked at their placement before anything. An open space between some mountings, a flatter part of the unique formations, would be a sort of perfect space for this sort of building or this small gathering of them, so it made sense that someone could put one there. Otherwise, the forest across the way is another option for things like this if they wanted to live above ground, so I also added a few there as well. I finalised it with a bit of brown in the ground, almost like it's a path people use, or places people have commonly tread, and it seems like a nice area supporting the piece, that I can then develop further at a later date if I withdraw this idea. Either way, I can revisit in the world building stage in the notes. I did have to though remind myself of my own logic though. Too much detail can sometimes make a piece worse than less. Sometimes less is more and all of that. I tend to get stuck into my own ideas and my own logic more often than not, and tend to get stuck thinking that I have to draw everything, just until I settle for impressions and so on. So this part of the drawing ended up under this category, though in saying that, it did actually help in getting that out of my mind for this one. It actually did help somewhat being able to throw it away, and to throw away that need for detail early on, just so I didn't get stuck on it later when I came to the larger forest details or the trees, or even meant for the further back mountains. And yes, it is something I'm sort of working on, and I have been for some time, but I do think that I'm getting better with the idea that not everything needs to have full levels of detail all the time. So I do usually manage to avoid it or work around it. But that's enough of that sort of, not really negative point, but more of a less than positive point. But let's move on to the next detail. Those being the walkways across the ravine and the details I added to places like the mountains where the entrances are. After all, I had this idea for the town, and that means it ultimately has to be walkable, or people at least need to be able to get from point A to point B without being stopped by a large gap in the centre of it. So I kind of needed a way to connect them all. This is, quite clearly, where the grassy sections come into play that I introduced and added throughout the layers in the ravine. See, it sort of made sense with the environment that it would have ledges and other such formations. Yet I still needed to look at how they would bridge together or just connect. All of these are just the little things and the little signs of life that people do inhabit it, rather than it being a natural thing entirely. And all of it is with the goal to set it apart from looking like it formed that way, versus it being made that way by the inhabitants. So I introduced the idea of the wooden walkways while sketching. They began in the background, in the turns of the ravine that are quite hard to see from the point of view of the image. But those are otherwise developed from there, with the bridges and such that I wanted to add. But it really wasn't enough for what I had in mind. So, looking at the vertical depth of the ravine, I decided to add other platforms that looked as if they are adding their own layers and such, just at various heights to suit their different needs. These are then the sections I add with these stilts, that are then mainly signs of them adapting the space to fit their wants. It also made sense to include. They have the height to work with, so why not? It's sort of then that logic that I apply to the walkways. They would want to continue them for convenience where one of the grounds happened to stop or one ledge happened to end. So I figured that they would have the system for how to build them anyway, and on how to keep them sturdy. Though I will admit I was drawing them and had my own doubts about their safety. Maybe in the world building I can afford some time towards railings in this part of the world, though they currently go a bit overlooked. Either way though, it was fun to sort of imagine with these how the layers would act and how they would wind. They wouldn't really have to be a straight line, and could instead bend to the ravine's walls as a sort of natural mirror to what a ledge would have been. Though, further to this, it's then why I added the forest section to it all. I haven't really touched on that yet, as there isn't much to say. But it makes sense that these structures are present within this context as they have a nearby, and obvious, supply of the material to build it with. It also makes sense since this way works better with the upkeep and any maintenance that they would have to do with it, just to ensure that it remained safe for continued use. If I had gone with the original desert idea, it would have been more likely that the walkways were carved into the side of the stone, rather than something being built on supports. That's really only because I could imagine it harder to find the resources that people would need to upkeep elements like this in that sort of environment. Or at least it would be harder to justify the continued use of it, I imagine. But with a forest right there, and a wooden walkway, it made sense as they'd have no shortage if they needed it. But besides all of that, it had also been a fun detail. I love the idea of these towns sort of stacked on top of themselves underground, just so none can see the expanse of them, but at the same time, the ravine being a signal to its location, and just as something that may look busier and built up with the walkways being these little signs. It was then also a little nod to this that I added it onto the front pillar. It made sense to bridge that little gap, though again, I could have maybe looked at adding a railing or something to it all. Maybe in a later draft they can be added, but otherwise they would know better than being too close to the edge anyway. But with all of that being said, let's actually look at the next detail. Our second to last detail that I want to touch on here is then the waterfalls I decided to add across the piece. And I will say it now, those were things that I only added as I drew the flats and the shading's outcome. They were part of the image that originally wasn't going to be part of anything until it ended up here. And I can't say I minded it either. A certain waterfall helping to add to the ideas of the town, after all, as well. See, it sort of ties into before as well. But with the waterfall that I added, the one that flows into the ravine, it sort of made sense to me to think that the bottom of it could be occupied by a small river of some sort, or at least a water feature in a strange sense. It was only an idea though, nothing I've actually gotten to flesh out as of yet, but it sort of made me think and try to imagine what it could be like. Before this, it would have been stone or some sort of overgrown space, but the water was an interesting idea with the way that it comes down from the mountains as well. It almost let me consider how this settlement would incorporate it or use it. Maybe further down there are more that flow into it like this one scene. Maybe there isn't. I will admit that this detail is one that I added and that I am still considering if I like it or not for this space in the world. All I knew is that it made sense for them to have some kind of water supply nearby to the town. Firstly, for a reason to settle there, shelter and water being two key components to it all. And the other reason being to explain the natural forests around and why this area just seems to flourish so much more around the river. It again could also tie into food sources, the pillar-like terrain potentially being iffy for things like farming, I imagine. So it really gives me a few more things to explore and pick apart as I build this space in the world, and also develop the ideas to where all of this ties in. I would say it works fairly well in this form too for this purpose. I mean, it is a tiny detail that took maybe all of, 5 minutes to add? Yet it sparks questions and ideas that helps further build up this sense of the idea and this part of the world, and also all of the strands of the world that connect to it, without there being much hassle that comes from including it. And if it doesn't work in the long run, this is only the first draft of the space, and it is very open to changes later if I need to, or if I need to remove something or replace them. But instead, with the time left here, let's get into my final point, as there isn't anything more to really say about these. See, the details and the shading had been a bit of a challenge in this one. I mean, I had my orders and my processes that I always use, a sort of basic and generic idea of what I would include to wrap it all up, yet it wasn't so simple in practice for this piece. I don't want to get caught up in all of that though, as there is no point ending this off in a negative tone. So I instead will kind of run through my favourite details of the shading that were fun to work on, all things considered, and just the bits that I want to draw attention to. The first of these being the shading of the ravine itself. After all, I thought it would give me a headache to work out how to do it, and just how to show the depths to it all, and also to maybe show the winding nature of it. Yet it actually wound up so simple to complete, I could instead focus on enjoying it before anything else. There were definitely other parts of the drawing that gave me more of a headache, but it was mainly done via a lot of implications, as well as gradient shading, just to make sure that it was clear that the bottom section is darker, it's deeper down, and just to make it clear that the top parts are really only in the shadows from the overgrown sections on top of it all. Doing the same with the stone itself was then simple enough, all things considered, and I could still make some stylistic choices here and there as I needed. These are mainly things like the lines added to show the stone's texture, just as I needed to do it, but also doing it via hatching and doing it subtly in some sections, more so than others. It's also why I draw in the lines in the earlier stage to sort of show the turns of it, and the bits that crop out a bit more from the ravine side. I didn't need any of the shading to stand out too much though, is what I'm trying to say. So everything ended up quite subtle in some sense. This was the same with the bushes. Different areas getting different levels of detail. And it was all really done just to however I saw fit at that moment. The ones that were closest to the camera got more individual leaves, and the further back sections are little more than dots of colours overlapping each other, just to make it seem that the colours and tones are blending into each other and that there are shadows and some element of light, just without making it too obvious or too easy to denote and work out. They're more the details that the eyes wouldn't really see anyway. But the main hassle given to me by shading the bushes had been little more than actually trying to differentiate the different sections of the bushes, mainly where they had been along the ravine's top or further in. I kind of had to get comfortable with the idea that things sort of visually mixed together in places, especially places like the ravine's deeper parts, only because it wouldn't make much sense for the eye to crisply see everything there anyway. It had also actually been a slight issue I had with the rest of the bushes and shading sections too. I didn't want to define anything too much or define too many of them, because as I've touched on slightly, it wouldn't make much sense that they would be so clear. The eye can only see so much and so far. In the end, I made exceptions and let myself do as I wanted with it all. It's why I spend time on things like blades of grass here and there later in the shading, even though it makes little sense in terms of scale or detail. It just made the piece look a little bit nicer in my opinion, and I knew it as part of my process. It was also more focusing on the sense of the place in this image, and not really the finest points of everything that could be addressed at this stage. If I spent longer detailing it, it would have lost the sense of the concept that I wanted to keep, and I would have spent longer ironing out every single detail of the town just before I ever put pen to tablet. Yet the second to last shading point that I do want to touch on is actually the sky and points like it. In the background, I added one corner of the taller mountains, and a silhouette almost more central to the horizon in the other places. This wasn't something I had originally done until the end of the sketch, yet it's simple and it adds to the piece in a very subtle way that I can't really explain too much. But it does make it clear, and it's a little further away, and it's something more in the horizon. And this also then gave me the idea to add birds into the sky. And these birds are really my favourite of tiny details. Yes, they're simple and not really obvious, but I had fun with their shapes, and it was such a simple and fun thing to add that it can also be quite easily ignored in the overall thing. I didn't need them, not really, but now I really love those background birds, and they're probably going to be something that I decide to expand upon when it comes to the world building, just to kind of establish what sort of local wildlife is even in this area, just so I have something to reference when I come to use it for a setting. And it is very likely that this will later be a setting for some kind of story. If I don't, then I will surprise even myself. Now, finally, I do want to touch on the trees and how I shaded them. I have touched on their colour, yes, but I want to take maybe about a minute to just address the shading. The first part of it had been that I needed the light to help them stand out a bit more visually, just with everything going on around it and such. Though, looking back, I am sort of glad that I added these details and bits of light, as I feel that I could now maybe make it a sort of sign of magic in the world. As I have said, it is all fantasy. So it makes sense that there are little things here and there that are affected by magic that maybe can't quite be explained as easily as other things. In the drawing, it's shade and light. Yet now I feel that I could potentially build some element into these trees that make that light a bit more built in, perhaps. Or part of the tree in some capacity. Maybe something like magic within the bark, perhaps. Who is to quite say yet? But in saying that, it does actually wrap up this week's video as we come to the end of the piece. Thank you so much for watching this far, and I hope I have managed to explain the project well enough here, just as well as everything else, since during the span of this script, I have actually been working on it and expanding everything around it. And it is something that I'm having so much fun developing. So I am actually looking forward to when I may be able to introduce the first part of it here. Either way, thank you for watching and I hope you enjoyed it. I will hope to see you another day in another week, but for now, goodbye and have a wonderful day.